Hello and welcome to Groovecast, the podcast for the rhythm section with me, Ashley Walker.
And me, Charlie Smith.
And in today's episode, we're going to do a sort of second part to our little kind of series we're doing called Three of a Kind. Last time we talked about Paul McCartney, and in doing so, we kind of talked about this fella as well that we're going to talk about today, Jeff Lynne. And what I love about this is, I don't know about you, Charlie, but in doing research, I thought I knew Jeff Lynne and ELO, and some of the stuff he'd done, but kind of finding the picks to fit this criteria, I realised how many I didn't know. So yeah, I'm looking forward to this one.
Yeah, should be interesting.
So we've got our three categories, haven't we? The obvious track. Obviously either a big hit or one everybody will know, but you can't help but love. The groovy one, maybe a slightly lesser known one, but one that has a great groove. And then the deep cut, which is one that's probably overlooked. So, do you want to kick us off with your obvious one?
Yeah, and it was weird writing some of these some of the stuff you thought was maybe obvious to you or obvious to us. When you actually look at some of the listening figures on it, you go, actually, that's not as popular as, say, some of the one you would think would be maybe a bit less obvious. So
Sure,
yeah,
yeah.
my obvious one was just purely a favourite, which uh, I've loved for a long time. And it's Showdown, which was about 1973, I think it came out. And it's weird what turns you round to songs, because I overlooked it a bit until I was this years and years and years ago listening to some old John Lennon interviews, and he did an interview on US radio, uh, probably in the mid 70s, and he named this as his favourite ELO song, which sort of pricked
Mm.
my ears and went, "Oh, I better go and listen to that." And he actually referred to ELO as "son of Beatles," which I thought was quite nice. You know,
Yeah.
I think he liked what they were doing and sort of what Jeff and in particular was probably doing, continuing some of the some of the ideas the Beatles had sort of started on Pepper and later on in the 60s.
Yeah.
So yeah, Showdown is kind of a, I suppose it's sort of like a slower, just more meat and potatoes groove. There's not really much happening in the drum world. It's pretty straight all the way through. Bev Bevan's one of those players, I know we'll probably talk about later on in a couple of other picks, where it's just really down the line. He's not really deviating from the groove much, and it's nice because it just lets the bass line just sit on top of it, and the bass line's a little bit more involved. Some nice little runs and bits and pieces. Even just at the very top of the song, the little run that gets the bass in is really really nice. I always quite like that little moment. But it's for me, it's just got everything that a great ELO track should have. You know, the sweeping strings and that really nice change of going from legato strings to pizzicato and stuff. That's just on so Jeff Lynne that and you can just tell it's one of his. It was that he was arranging and co-arranging strings at that point. And just the entire song has that. I think Paul McCartney put it best in the Jeff Lynne documentary that I know both of us have seen probably numerous times, and if you haven't seen that, would recommend. And he just said the ELO music, you just it just rolls over you, and I think
Mm.
that's just this is a perfect example of a song that just for me, you listen to it without really listening to it.
Mm.
You can just sort of, it's the sort of song that you can just sort of relax into and just enjoy. You're
Yeah.
not picking it apart all the time, like probably we do a bit too much with certain artists or certain genres of music, definitely. But yeah, and the little crowning sort of glory in it for me is the orchestral interlude towards the end, where it just goes into complete free time and then straight back in with the groove to the last chorus. And I just think that's a stroke of genius as far as arranging it. I don't know who put that there and thought, well, why don't we just stop the song for an undetermined length of time, put a lovely orchestral pattern in for about 5 bars, and then get straight back in. It's just yeah. So yeah, I think that would be my obvious one. I think so. What about you?
Well, I think it's interesting what you're saying there about sort of the drums not being a lot going on with the drum part, and I think it's I think we know. I don't know if we touched on it before. Sort of Jeff Lynne was one of those, and this sort of mid 70s, early 70s era was when they started doing the looping, didn't they? And I think was it Don't Bring Me Down? Is it?
Yeah, that's all looped,
Yeah. So
pretty much.
it doesn't surprise you really. I think there's a lot of that going on with this stuff, but with my obvious one, like you were saying, it's funny in doing the research into it. Wanted to use this as my obvious one because I just think it's really hard to pick, the what you think is the best one or your favorite one. And
They're
I
just
think
all so good.
yeah, and it's what's funny as well is I think we both neither of us have gone for what a lot of people would say is the obvious one, Mr. Blue Sky, which I
Yeah,
just think it kind of I think number one people have spoken. There's been enough said about it to sort of we don't need to kind of go over it. And secondly, it's just we've both probably heard it a million times. And with this pick, my one, I've gone for Telephone Line, and it's one that there was a period where I used to listen to it a lot, to be fair, but going back to it today, I just absolutely love it. And yeah, it's one. It isn't. It is an obvious one, but it's not probably one that people go to straight away. But it was. It was. I think it went to number 8 at the time in the UK. I think number 1 in Canada and a couple of places around the world. There's a great acoustic version of it on YouTube. I'm sure you've seen with Richard Tandy on piano and Jeff just playing acoustic guitar, which just shows their versatility.
yeah. There's. I think that's part of it. There is a full 40-minute or so concert that they did. I think it's called the Bungalow Sessions, named
Yeah,
after Jeff's house. But yeah, if you haven't seen that entire sort of house concert, if you will, is just beautiful. And you just hear the banter between the two of them, just you know, having a few false starts with things, or trying to remember how they did this or that. And yeah, I love that concert. That's something I could. It's the sort of thing I put on if I've got something to do. If I've got
yeah,
something to, writing some stuff out or tidying up or whatever, cleaning, whatever it might be. That's a classic of just something sort of easy listening, but still with that bit of great musicianship and everything that we love.
yeah. And the track itself, the full version, there's obviously just stunning harmonies, which you expect from a Jeff Lynne song. The string arrangement is great, and I love as we know and we have talked about before, Jeff Lynne obviously heavily influenced by the Beatles, as you even touched on there. And you can hear sort of, I think, the George Martin influences in his string arrangements. You kind of hear him in this one, and the way that you've got kind of that classical, sort of crossover with the strings, and then in the sort of doo-wop section, it's sort of like a 50s throwback, and and then the whole thing of the song being this telephone call, I think is just really clever, and the way they recreated that really retro, not retro at the time, but that 70s the phone call sound when the dial-up thing.
Yeah, I heard in an interview or read somewhere that they literally made a phone call, and it would have been British Telecom at the time, or BT as we know it now. And I think they literally went on and got the two notes that make that sort of that dial tone. It's very, yeah. It's one of those things. They could have just rang it up and recorded it through the phone, but they decided to recreate it because that's what ELO do.
Yeah, so yeah, that's my obvious pick, Telephone Line. So
Yeah,
yeah,
and I think it's probably good to say while we're on the obvious ones that there is an album of that Jeff put out about 2012 where he basically re-recorded all of ELO's hits himself. There was stuff that maybe he wasn't happy about the first time, and it's interesting listening to that versus the originals, because it's definitely more, if you want to say, polished. for me, this a lot of the rhythm sounds a bit cleaner and a bit nicer. The strings don't match because I think he's probably using really good plugins and stuff and nice synthesizers and all that. But the strings just don't equal what they did back then. I don't know. I don't know if it's just us being like that certain charm of the originals that we like, but it's worth a listen because he recorded it under ELO. It's really hard sometimes to distinguish, especially if you're looking on Spotify or YouTube, which recording is the original ELO and which is his re-recording. But you can tell the difference if you know both.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just worth mentioning. You know, if someone's got more time on their hands, go and listen to the
Yeah.
new versions and the old versions because it is an interesting comparison to make.
I think it's worth saying as well. You know, it doesn't need to be said, but he's just like such a genius. I think, and one of the most underrated artists. And you know what we were saying about him being influenced by the Beatles and George Martin. You know, the difference being that the Beatles had someone like George Martin to do those arrangements, whereas I think with a lot of this stuff and the stuff that he would go on to produce for other people, it was him and in some instances Richard Tandy and stuff doing those arrangements themselves. So yeah, awesome.
Yeah, indeed. So on to groovy ones. Let's have a little dive into some ELO groove. Um, so yeah, I mean, my pick for this was quite an obvious one, and I mean, if anyone knows this particular track, within the first four bars, you know why it would be
Yeah,
probably a fairly standard pick for this, which would be "Last Train to London," which is off the Discovery album, I believe, which would have been late 70s, about 79. And I think it
yeah.
was also released as a double A side with Confusion, which is another great tune. But um, but yeah, for me, this is it's just like that really funky uh, bass line. I suppose it's almost verging on slap bass at the time, but not totally.
Mm,
And sort of, uh, it's got that sort of disco twinge to it that you sort of expect from the late 70s. With again Bevan on kit, just keeping it super simple and locked together, and sort of letting that bass line take the crown of it, which I believe was Kelly Grocott
yeah.
or Graucut on bass. And yeah, you know, it's just one of those songs that you can listen to over and over again, and it never gets dull. I think that's probably this. We can say the same for a lot of ELO and Jeff Lynne stuff in general. Is you know you're always finding new little string lines or new little things hidden in there that you hadn't heard before, and you just catch them every now and again. You go, oh, I didn't realize that was going on. But yeah, it's sort of like for me that's sort of all of the best bits of ELO, but over a very disco bass. You know, I say bass line as in the the bottom of the band is very disco, not just the bass line. But
Yeah.
yeah, but then it's got all the yellow strings over the top and the luscious harmonies and all that, and a really nice piano synth solo in the middle, which is really cool.
Mm. Yeah, I know when we were trying to think of the groovy ones for this, I had heard this one before. I think through you telling me to check it out. And so for me, going for my groovy one, because again, like I said at the start of this episode, I thought I knew ELO and but then when it came to groovy ones and what we think of as a groovy one, I was well, you know, that has a great feel or that has a great drum, you know, thing going on. But yeah, that's the obvious one, and it is. It just has such a great. You can't help but sort of bop along to it. It is really cool. But for me, looking for my pick, I think is off the same album, and you know, you've got that track on there. And then the one I went for was a track that I hadn't heard until you know doing the research for this one. I think I listened to it this first time I heard this track was yesterday. Um, but and to start off with it, you know, if you listen to it off the back of this episode, you might think, why have I gone for it? Because the start of it is just this gorgeous melody on almost like a theremin sounding instrument. I'm not sure what it is. And it's an almost sort of ballad called Wishing. It's sort of, it's not quite a ballad, but it's got a, and again, very simple sort of, the bass line is grooving, but it's fairly simple. And same with the drums, but it's just kind of, as we like to say, in the pocket. It's just sort of sitting there. Right, really reminds me of sort of an average white band sort of ballad of that era. Quite syncopated but simple. Um, and the string lines, listening to it all the way through towards the end, I think going into the last chorus, really remind me of Love's Theme, that track, the Barry White track. And that, again, harmony is very sort of Beatles esque towards the end. I think it's sort of that Abbey Road era kind of sound. But I was listening to it and then looking at the reviews and everything of it, and I just thought, what a great song! I've never heard it before. It's certainly going on my playlist now.
Yeah, can't really argue with those little unexpected surprise tracks like that. I mean, like you say, it was one that certainly wasn't on my radar when you told me you were picking it. So it was one that I sort of only heard very recently too. I think I'd heard it on the album when I've had the album spinning, but it's one of those that you have to really tune into to appreciate. You know, if it's just
Yeah,
sort of, if you're just letting it pass you by, you probably wouldn't clock onto the just what was going on in there. But when you actually put it on with intent to listen, it was like, oh, this is a great track, and I
yeah.
think it's probably going to end up on my my slightly more regular listening as well.
Yeah, I remember listening to an because it, with that as well. What I was saying about the love themes string kind of sound in there, and I guess as well that was the era, the sort of late '70s kind of disco thing. And I remember listening to an interview a couple of years ago when I was really, used to listen to Out of the Blue all the time. Um, and I think in the '70s it was kind of, for a lot of people, seemed a bit unpopular to be into ELO. It was kind of a bit of a lame thing for not musicians, but for just average, you work in Joe kind of thing, on the street. So, and I can kind of, when I was listening to it, I can kind of see why, because it's almost, with the strings, probably a bit more sophisticated for that era. But doing the research and listening to these songs, and a song like Wishing, which we'd never heard before, they're just one of those bands that, in fact, each album that we've picked our tracks off, I could probably listen to all the way through and kind of love most of the songs, and even the ones that are lesser known, I probably still really like. So it's very unique, and I think we'll both be kind of doing some more listening after this episode.
Yeah, I suspect so.
So we've got our sort of deep cut pick, our lesser known, or maybe one that's buried in a great album, like we've just
Yeah.
talked about.
Yeah. Now, this is where I sort of had the opposite thing to you of I found it hard to find a track that was a real, that I knew that was a real deep cut, because I thought, well, every track that you think, oh, that's probably a lesser known one, when you look at it, it's actually quite popular. It's been on
Exactly, yeah.
because they just had that knack of making so many hits and so many great sounding records. That they're, I don't know if you've ever seen ELO or in the modern iteration, but the entire set list is pretty much all hits. There's not really any B-sides that are lurking in the entire set list, because it's all stuff that you would know.
Mm.
And it's ELO's one of those bands that if you're not fully aware of them, it's the sort of band where you could hear one song and think, oh, I don't really know much ELO, but then the minute that you start hearing other ELO songs, you go, oh, well, actually, turns out I know all of these, but you didn't necessarily realize it was the same band. So yeah, mine's a bit less of a deep cut, but more of a song I think sort of really underrated and has a bit
Mm.
more of an interesting backstory to it, which I thought was worth having a chat about. So it was the tune I actually picked is a Jeff Lynne tune, but wasn't originally recorded by ELO.
Yeah.
It's a song called "Do Ya," which was recorded, I think, we're in '71 when he was in the Move. So obviously this is him, Roy Wood, Bev Bevan, Richard Tandy, all pre-ELO happening. I think ELO started their first ELO album was '72, either '71 or '72. But they were basically working on this Move album as a record company obligation at the same time. So they
Mm.
did they put this song "Do You" on it. And then when ELO got started, they started performing it live because it's one of Jeff's tunes. You know, obviously at that point they didn't really have. They probably had one album or two albums of worth of material to pick a live set from. So obviously they were probably picking stuff from the Move or stuff from other stuff that they'd done to add to the set list.
Mm.
So that it became a set list favorite. And I was reading a Bev Bevan interview, and he basically said the reason they re-recorded it was because a music journalist asked the band their opinion of the original version of that song in inverted commas, which this journalist said was by Todd Rundgren, uh, and his the band that he was with at the time, Utopia, who'd recorded, who'd been performing that song around the same time and released a recording on another live, which was a live album that Utopia did, and, and I think they were all a bit cheesed off that they were basically crediting this song to them, even though it was the Move had done it originally, and so they decided to re-record it as ELO to let everyone know it was a Jeff Lynne tune, which I thought was
Yeah.
quite interesting. But and I know this was, I think, a bit of news to you because I sent you the Move version this morning to have listened to, and I made some notes on why what I prefer. But I just for interest, why don't you? Let's throw it over to you and just see what you made of that original version.
Yeah, as I think you said, it's so. Yeah, I wouldn't have thought it was um, that different, but it's so raw compared to the ELO version, and I don't know if it's just because of they got more sophisticated or what it will maybe his production, Jeff Lynne's production, kind of improved or whatever. But yeah, it's so raw, and it's kind of funny to think it's the same people, or certainly Richard Tandy and Jeff Lynne.
Yeah, it was basically exactly the same lineup because from what I was reading, they were recording the first ELO album at the same time as they were recording the last Move album because they had to do a Move album for contractual
Yeah,
obligation. Uh, but they didn't really want to do it because they'd already started this new band called ELO and they were already making what turned out to be the first ELO album, self-titled, or it was also referred to as No Answer. That first ELO album. So yeah, so they were. I suppose their head was in other places. I don't know whether it was just rushed or they just were like, well, just do it the way we've always done it, hammer it out and sod off.
yeah, get out of here.
Yeah, but like you say, it is a really raw version to listen to, and it is a bit. It does seem a little bit like it was probably rushed at the recording stage. You know, things aren't totally synced up where you would normally expect them to be.
Yeah,
And this is considering this is not like a bootleg or anything. This was released on the Move's last album. But for me, the ELO version is more polished, and there's stuff that is on the ELO version that when you go back and listen to the Move version, you miss, or at least I do. So it's like those opening slide guitar, uh, glissandos, if you like. Uh, they they are like the signature of the track. And when you listen to the Move version, they're not there. There's
yeah,
a slide guitar a bit later on that doesn't do, you know, that's not doing what you're used to hearing. And then obviously the strings that they stuck all over the bridge, which really lift it up. The original sounds a little bit jangly and a bit. sort of one guitar and a bit of lead over the top, where
Yeah,
they really went to town with the orchestration later on, and probably put a lot of what they'd learned on that first Yellow album into use, of loads of strings and guitar overdubs and synths and all that. Because I know that first Yellow album was basically was Roy Wood with and Jeff Lynne, and they got hold of some cheap Chinese made cello, and Roy Wood just taught himself how to find notes, get a sound, and he would just go in and I think if you listen to 10538 Overture, which is I suppose the first real true ELO song, um, which is what sort of birthed the whole thing. And I think they said it was Roy Wood playing the cello 15 times, overdubbed and stacked on top of each other to make it sound really big. So it's I suppose that what they sort of learnt doing all of that of where how to then orchestrate for when they probably got real string players in later on and did things a bit more properly. But you could sort of tell they were at that discovering phase of of that late move, early ELO stuff, and then. But yeah, I think I definitely prefer the ELO version. I don't know about you.
it reminds me of when you listen to Creedence Clearwater Revival songs after listening to the covers or after playing them with a band. No disrespect to Creedence Clearwater Revival because they've got some cool songs, but they just sound really lame compared to the covers or the version that you do with a band or that kind of thing. But yeah, that's what it reminded me of
Yeah,
anyway.
I sort of get that. There's a bit of charm in the originals, which I suppose there is
Yeah,
with this as well. There's a bit of enjoyment in listening to the Moves version, but I think the ELO version has a lot more about it, and I think they probably spent. It was probably all those years of playing it live that really honed an arrangement and honed it to be really studio ready.
yeah. So for my deep cut, yeah, like you were saying, I mean, I found it quite easily because I knew I wanted to pick this track, but I don't know, like you say, it it was part of that album Out of the Blue, which obviously was a big hit and everything, and it probably is known. So I'm just gonna let that one slide. Uh, so, but it's a song called "Across the Border," and the reason I wanted to pick it was, uh, when I was sort of started to get into music and growing up, this was one of the albums that was in my dad's car and traveling to gigs with him, and I used to make him play it to death. He made the mistake of playing it to me once and me liking it, and then we had to listen to it all the time. And this was just one of those tracks. I loved everything on that album, but this is one that just weirdly kind of jumped out at me at the time. I think it's probably that frantic energy kind of in the verses, which listening to it again yesterday, um, without um, looking into it or anything at that time, I thought about the verses. I thought that sounds a bit kind of like Heroes and Villains, the Beach Boys, like in the verses. So then doing the research on it, I saw that it has been likened to that, and it's very reminiscent of that song, and the sort of the melody's quite similar, and the actual feel of that sort of chugging along thing. So I don't know if there was any lawsuit there. I don't think so. But and then the actual, obviously it's very Mexican sort of themed with the trumpets, and I guess that's kind of the nature of the song across the border. Um, but the actual vocal sort of style in the verses really reminded me of Bob Dylan. And obviously, we know that later on they'd go and do the Traveling Wilburys with Bob Dylan and George Harrison and all that. But yeah, just the sort of in the verses and some of the way he sort of sung it, it just reminded me of it. Just that sort of like kind of thing. It just reminded me of Bob Dylan. But yeah, I love this. I love the song, and you know, again, great string arrangement. And so yeah, for sort of the nostalgia and it's all that kind of verse, and then you've got the sort of little chorus section, which I think is very catchy, and it used to always, yeah, just one of those songs that I had to listen to. So that's what I went for.
Yeah, it's another one that for me was a bit of a new track to listen to in the sense because I hadn't heard it maybe heard it once or twice, but not really paid much attention to it. But yeah, you're not wrong. It's a really cool little track, and again, like we said before, it's quite nice to do these sort of little rundowns because not only do they hopefully give listeners and watchers and all that something new to listen to, but also sometimes us we get
Yeah.
something new to dive into, which we maybe either haven't heard before or haven't really appreciated before. So it's always interesting, and yeah, if you are listening to this, go on the socials and suggest who we should maybe cover in another one of these three of a kinds. We've done Paul McCartney, we've done Jeff Lynne. Is there any others that we should be chomping at the bit to run six tunes and discuss them like we have in this one a little bit?
Yeah, I think as what's true of Jeff Lynne and possibly others we may do is you could do another three of the songs that he produced for other people. Or I know in doing this episode we talked about we could have included the Traveling Wilburys. We felt like I loved his work on George Harrison's stuff, the Brainwashed album, and Cloud Nine and those projects. But yeah,
Yeah,
like you said, it gives you a chance that for us and hopefully for the listeners to go and check them out and listen a bit more in depth.
yeah, and it goes both ways. We could have just as easily with Jeff Lynne gone before ELO and done the stuff he did with the
Yeah.
Move, and then before that, I think it was the Idle Race uh, that he was with, where he had his first single, that he wrote. I think it was called "Imposters of Life's" magazine. Which again, go listen to it. It's very bizarre. It's very mid to late '60s. It's got that sort of uh, Telstar-ish sound to it. Very primitive sounding. Um, and yeah, it's it's also the song he got. It was his first ever songwriting credit, and he got miscredited on it as G. Lynn without the E on the end, which he wasn't very happy about when he saw the single and thought, "Who's that?" No E on Lynn, and what does G stand for? Gordon, not Jeff. But yeah, he wasn't best pleased about that. But it's quite an interesting song to go back and check out. And I don't know if you had any other honourable mentions, but I mean the whole ELO catalogue's pretty much an honourable mention, I think, in this case.
yeah. I love. Obviously, we know of when we talked of the two tracks he did for the Beatles in the '90s. I love, and that I talked about "Free as a Bird" on our track of the week. I love the production on that, and yeah, the Brainwashed album, George Harrison. I love what he did to that. It was obviously released after he died with Danny Harrison, his son, and Jeff Lynne, and yeah, did him justice, I think. So
Yeah,
they'd be
I
my
think
other
the Roy
ones.
Orbison stuff's great to check out as well. I mean, some of the stuff Jeff did with Roy Orbison's great. California Blue and You Got It, of course. Some of that is great to listen to, and some of the, yeah, like you said, the Wilbury stuff, the Tom Petty stuff. Again, I think gets a bit overlooked sometimes in Jeff Lynne's catalogue, even though they were at the time absolutely huge songs and really popular. Um, but also Jeff Lynne's solo album. I know we discussed this the other day, which he's done a couple of odd solo projects over the years. Either under the ELO banner or under his own name. And the one that we were talking about was Long Wave, which was all the sort of covers of tunes that he liked as a kid or growing up, or that have meant something to him, but done with that really polished Jeff kind of style. I know there's a great version of She on Long Wave. The sort of very classical sort of tune, but also stuff like Somewhere Beyond the Sea, which is equally brilliant to hear Jeff singing. And but I think my favourite track on that would be Mercy Mercy, which is, I think, a Rolling Stones song, and they did a great video. Which we enjoyed watching, of when they were doing the Jeff Lynne documentary, where they filmed him playing it with himself 5 times
Yeah.
over, which was just a really cool idea, and sort of sums up, I think, everything you need to know about Jeff. Is just, he's probably the best kind of control freak. in
Yeah,
that he can, in the same way of like Paul McCartney post the Beatles, he can do everything himself. He plays
yeah,
great bass, he plays great guitar, piano, drums, sings great. The harmonies are all bob on. So he's like, yeah, he's a bit of a not a jack of all trades, but a master of all trades.
yeah. I think that's a perfect place to end it as well. So
Yeah,
yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Groovecast.
and we'll see you next time.